Good evening, everyone. My name is Professor Lou Harms, and I'm the Chair and the Head of the Department of Social Work here at the University. I really want to welcome you all this evening to the 2022 Len Tierney Lecture. Whether you're our alumni, our colleagues, our students, members of the Tierney family who are here with us tonight, Michael, Rosie, Lachlan, Rebecca, and possibly others, we welcome all of you to this really important conversation ahead. As we gather virtually, and probably just as well virtually on a night like tonight with the rain, I want to acknowledge that wherever we are, we're actually on place, on country, living and working on Indigenous land. And I want for all of us to acknowledge that land and place where we're gathering tonight. For us at the university and for those across Melbourne, many of us are on Wurundjeri land of the Kulin Nation. And so I want to pay our respects to their elders past and present. I also want to acknowledge the allyship and partnership with our First Nations colleagues and students here within the department and any First Nations people joining us this evening. So as many of you will know, this event is a really important event in our annual calendar of the department. It's a lecture in memory of Dr. Len Tierney, and we take a moment to celebrate his life and in particular the legacy that he has left to the social work profession and in many other ways to many other professions. A little bit of background about Dr. Tierney. He graduated from the University of Melbourne with a Bachelor of Arts and a Diploma of Social Studies, the then qualification in social work, back in 1947. And he went on to study both his Master's and PhD at Columbia University in New York, and has later been recognised as a pioneer there at that Columbia School of Social Work. He developed throughout his career an enduring passion and respect for excluded families who are struggling with the many crises of daily life. And they were particularly families in the post-war emergency housing context in the 1950s. Len was a vitally important member of the Melbourne University Social Work Department, and that involvement was from 1961 through to 1990, his retirement, some 29 years of service to this department. His scholarly and community contributions were diverse and vast, and they were focused primarily on the area of child and family welfare, as so many of you know. And it was his groundbreaking book in 1964, Children Who Need Help, that really provided that basis for substantial developments in both out-of-home care for children and also for services for families in difficulty. So tonight, Cathy will certainly speak much more extensively to his legacy in the lecture ahead, and I will leave that in her very capable hands. Just before we move into that part of the evening, though, I do want to add to the legacy that Len Tierney has left our department, because tonight I'm really delighted to announce that we have inaugural student recipients of the Len Tierney Social Work Travelling Award. In this last month, 2 recipients of that award have been selected. His very generous bequest keeps alive, I think, in so many ways, his deep commitment to academic and practice excellence and the nexus of those two. That award will enable a student or two each year to travel to the US, primarily to connect with Columbia University for a study tour. So due to COVID restrictions over these last 2 years, we haven't been able to award recipients, but over this year, we've been able to award to 2 students who are finishing mid-year this year, and we'll be able to award to another at the end of the year. So we have 2 outstanding applicants for that MSW award, Gayatri Jambalingam and Grace Haslinghouse, who have been selected to head off and pursue this study tour in the year ahead. So I want to congratulate them and hope you'll join me in doing so. I also want to thank Professor Dorothy Scott, Dr. Trish McNamara and Associate Professor David Rose for joining with me in that selection task from really a pool of outstanding students who put in their application. And our intention with this award is that at each Len Tierney Lecture into the future, we'll hear a report back from those students about the lessons that they've learned from this extraordinary opportunity provided by the Tierney family. So there's much to celebrate tonight, and the other part of the celebration is to really celebrate Cathy's legacy and work in our department. So I now invite Janet Farrow, OAM, to introduce our guest speaker. Janet's our president of the University of Melbourne Social Work Alumni Association. And Janet, thank you now for introducing Cathy.
Thank you very much, Lou. Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Cathy Humphreys, who, as many of you will know, is a professor of social work at the University of Melbourne. She's also the founding member of the Melbourne Research Alliance to End Violence Against Women and Children, MAVE for short, and a chief investigator on the Safer Families Centre for Research Excellence. I should have said the NHMRC Centre for Research Excellence. Her research focuses on domestic and family violence and child abuse. In her early career, Cathy worked for 15 years as a social worker in Queensland and New South Wales. She then lived and worked in England at the University of Warwick from 1994 to 2006. In 2006, she returned to Australia and took up a 5-year position as Alfred Felton Chair in Child and Family Welfare, and then continued as a research professor at the University of Melbourne. In this past year, she's been the recipient of 2 Australian Research Council linkage grants, an extraordinary achievement. I invite Cathy to give the 2022 Len Tierney Memorial Lecture and to reflect on her career pathway in her lecture entitled Supporting Advocacy in Child Abuse, Domestic and Family Violence Through Research, Challenges and Changes. Thanks, Cathy.
So thank you very much, Janet. I really appreciate you introducing me in that way. And what a pleasure it is to be able to present the Len Tierney Lecture tonight. I was actually given a very broad title for this lecture. What are the learnings from your career? Looking backwards to move forward to go what I would call off salary. Some people call it retirement. But in academia, honorary positions allow a flexible landing, still working on stimulating projects and enjoying the work with PhD students. In fact, I'm actually not going off salary until the end of 2023. But this time next year, I hope to be in Iceland in the European Domestic Violence Conference. So it is a matter of seize the moment with the Len Tierney Lecture this year, supporting advocacy in child abuse, domestic and family violence through research, challenges, changes, and I should have added continuities. But first, let me begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of these unceded lands and waterways on which we meet today, and pay respects to elders past, present, and the emerging leaders, and particularly the emerging leaders that are in the audience today. Speaking out, I wanted to speak boldly and speak out about the role of advocacy and indeed of activist academics. However, I've been left feeling somewhat flummoxed about where to begin. There's 15 years of practice, 35 years of research, and about 90 research projects. So it's been a very winding journey. From the outset, I need to say that this is not my journey, or at least my journey has been a collective effort. More than 100 partnering organisations, more than 100 research colleagues, 36 PhD students, huge levels of support from friends and family members, and particularly my partner Ray and daughter Nikki. My fear is of making this a little bit like Adventures in Narcissism, rather than thinking about what might be the generalisations that can be made. There are many streams that make a river. I also wanted to begin by saying I don't feel as though I'm an expert in this area of advocacy around domestic and family violence and child abuse, or even the concept of an academic activist. However, I'm possibly an expert about some learnings in this area. I mean, if I was looking to successful advocates, I'd look to people like Rosie Batty and Grace Tame, who as individuals bravely stood up to make a difference based on their lived experience. And when understanding more about advocacy, I look to my daughter and her colleagues and friends in the climate change and renewable energy area. They plan, they strategize, they in the offices of key ministers throughout Australia. So I'm narrowing the field to the role of the academic researcher who is interested in contributing evidence to support and, dare I say, advocate for policy and practice change, and thinking about those generalizable learnings from there. Is there a role for advocacy, or maybe more accurately, academic activism? It's a winding journey, so river metaphors have come to mind. So if I get a little boring and introspective, then enjoy the pictures as metaphors for experiences. And so I guess the lesson out of this opening slide is to recognise that research, policy and practice change is based on a collective journey into which the work of others needs to be acknowledged, appreciated and enjoyed. So there are so many places to begin. So before I formally began at University of Melbourne, and just after I arrived back in Melbourne from the UK to take up my role as the Alfred Felton Chair of Child and Family Welfare, the Len Tierney Symposium was being held out at Darebin with Linda Campbell and several others as keynote speakers. For some reason, this then morphed into my responsibility in my new role. It's been a joy, an opportunity and a pressure. But it's also been such an important part of our work in the social work department. So here was a person of influence, Len Tierney, whose legacy has lived on. His attention to social justice, his advocacy for those in poverty, his influencing of generations of social workers cannot be underestimated. It's an important story of a contribution to advocacy and justice, leading by example. 16 speakers have presented the Len Tierney public lecture since. Harriet Macmillan, Nikki Stanley, Kerry Anabrina, Eileen Munro, I could go on. But recognising that key people of influence shine a light in a particular area of policy and practice creates an opportunity to draw public attention to an issue. They are not the strategy, but they can contribute to a change opportunity. Metaphors and shoulders of giants are clearly coming to mind here and are humbling as I begin this lecture and acknowledge the role of the Tierney family, who have always been supportive of this advocacy and profiling opportunity. So I guess the key learning out of this is that creating a plan around a high-profile person can be part of a broader change strategy, and thinking about how we can contribute to that in the future is important. So here's another beginning, the feminist journey. My feminist journey had early roots in my experience as an undergraduate social work student at Women's House in Brisbane. You can just see it, 50 women making collective decisions in very smoke-filled rooms, working to establish the first domestic violence service and refuge in Brisbane. And what did we notice? And one of the themes I'll come back to, particularly in the refuge, children out of control as the release from living with fear occurred. The trauma of their experiences were writ large in their behaviours. Their mothers often bewildered, distracted, traumatised and amazing in equal measure. It was my first real understanding of the impact of domestic and family violence on children. It's become a theme across my research journey, along with understanding domestic violence as an attack on the mother-child relationship by the person using violence. The feminist journey continues to this day, winding through all aspects of my personal and professional life. So is this just about me? Is there a generalist point to be made? So I believe that the idea of having a theoretical touchstone, whatever that might be, provides continuity and purpose in both personal and professional life. But those continuities shouldn't become atrophied and rigid. I do remember a pivotal discussion with Dr. Joni Smith when she was an early Melbourne PhD student. I remember saying to Joni, you can't be just an old-fashioned socialist feminist. But then I realised too that I'd not fully embraced intersectionality. a 2-year reading group with Gemma McGibbon and Bridget Hamilton and many others, became part of a journey about understanding that gender is not the only dimension through which inequality is embedded. It's so interesting to be currently reading Sarah Ahmed's book, Living a Feminist Life. And she's helped me to understand the intersections with transgender experiences. And again, these are important new learnings and areas of challenge which have been helpful to be thinking about how to embrace these issues. But feminist writers have always been influential. Judith Herman's Trauma and Recovery remains such an important piece of work. And there's been a ripple effect for me and in terms of her work in the impact on the social movement and understanding and being able to articulate this. Many of you would have seen this quote from me before. To hold traumatic reality in consciousness requires a social context that affirms and protects the victim and that joins victim and witness in common alliance. For the individual victim, the social context is created by relationships with friends, lovers, and family. For the larger society, the social context is created by political movements that give voice to the disempowered. And it seems to me that every generation needs to rediscover this point about bringing to light and breaking the silence, because domestic violence perpetrators will always say, if you tell anyone, they won't believe you. And so we have to create a counter narrative to that very powerful narrative provided by the person using violence. So moving along further, it was very important to me to also find a bridge between social work and feminism. And I think that social justice provided that bridge. A core principle in the ASW Code of Ethics, along with many others, includes that social workers advocate for change to social systems and structures that preserve inequalities and injustice. And certainly I did in my early career leave jobs where I didn't feel there was an alignment between my values and my work. So moving on to some of the content areas, and a consistent theme of the research that I've been undertaking over the years has been in relation to the mother-child relationship. Now, I have to say from the outset, this is a personal issue, as I'm both a mother as well as I also have a daughter. My PhD was on women whose children have been sexually abused. I have to say that was always a great conversation stopper at dinner parties and elsewhere. I remember Ray sitting beside me when someone would say, "Oh, and what's your thesis about?" I could see him go, "Oh no," that in fact it's a very important, and I found a subject of great interest, but not necessarily one that was for everyday social conversation. There are many streams, though, that continue to contribute to this area of research over time. There have been projects in the UK, the Talking to My Mother program, which led to 2 different activity books to help support both mothers and children as well as workers, strengthen the mother-child relationships. There's been terrific PhD students. Drs. Anita Morris and Dr. Shawana Andrews both did fabulous PhDs in this space. That we've had evaluations, Mothers in Mind evaluation, and then the work with David Mandel and the Safe and Together projects. There's been 5 of them now that are continuing over the years, and they are really about strengthening the mother-child relationship. But it's an area where there are many barriers, dams to this research and this space, that it's very hard to continuously get the message through that domestic violence is an attack on the mother-child relationship. And all our policy and practice settings tend to silo women and their children, adults and children. We're generally not training our workforce to strengthen the mother-child relationship. We are training workers with basic counselling skills often, and they are more designed for individuals rather than for working with relationships. And we know that so many women don't seek help because they're so afraid that seeking help may lead to them losing their children. For the most part, that's not true, but certainly the trope is out there very strongly. Have there been some positive developments in this area? I'd say there's been some really strong, and from my perspective, some really strong developments. The Victorian recovery programs for children that grew out of the therapeutic domestic violence recovery programs, really about half of those at least throughout Victoria have mother-child strengthening as a really important part of their remit. Across the Safe and Together projects that we've been working on over the last 5 years, through the program advisory groups and the communities of practice, has been, I worked out 1,250 practitioners that have been part of those projects. The Talking to My Mum and talking about abuse activity books, there's been about 12,000 of those sold. So I think that there are some areas where we can see that research in this area has been applied. Certainly, that's not all about me. There's been many, many voices in this space. But persistence, I think, also counts. And I think action research processes can also be important. Think about other areas of continuities. Another area that I would say is both an area of continuity rather than an area of change. This is the could do better bit. That what we know is that responding to children living with domestic violence recognises that many also live with mothers and fathers with substance use and mental health problems. And all the evidence points to the intersections of domestic and family violence with these other complexities, and particularly when we're thinking about the out-of-home care area. So it's about how do we get this message across? Because what we know is that where there's domestic and family violence, in the presence of substance use and mental health, these are used as part of the tactics of coercive control. I have to say, that back in the 2000s, I was doing research and writing papers in this space, and probably my most cited paper is one called, I call it Symptoms of Abuse, exploring the impact of living with domestic violence on women's mental health and the complexities of help seeking. But it's not an area where we've seen massive amounts of change in terms of linking mental health, and particularly women's mental health and its impact in the areas around living with domestic and family violence. I think, it was really a sad failure that inspired the many, many submissions to the Victorian Mental Health Royal Commission from ourselves at the University of Melbourne, as well as many, many community sector organisations. There was no link made in that Royal Commission with the previous Family Violence Royal Commission in that space. I think we've made more progress potentially in understanding substance use coercion and the ways in which that's used where there's domestic and family violence. And the Cody Research project with a wonderful group of practitioners, policy workers and researchers working through Odyssey House and Kids First have been really taking forward work in this area, as well as all our work on the Safe and Together projects has really, in particular the last two projects, the Stacey project and the Esty project. Stacey project was Safe and Together Addressing Complexity, is looking at those intersections, and we have been training up workers and engaging workers and policymakers in that space. So it is, I think, an example where we try to use research to shine a light in particular area of practice, but there are really many U-turns, many blockages along the way. So let me return now. I did feel as though I needed to talk a little bit about my research, but let's return now to some more beginnings and particularly the role of advocacy and thinking about the role of advocacy. Because I have to say that I didn't ever set out to be an academic or a researcher. That was a long way from what I thought I wanted to be. I had 16 years on the front line. I knew I had to move from frontline work, but I was frankly not interested in management and administration. I have to say, I'm not very good at that. But I was interested in research and teaching, which by contrast seemed to be a very good and exciting option. But I did feel like, how do you fit a round peg into a square hole? I was very interested. See, at the time in the early 90s, we were talking about femocrats, and there was a lot of discussion in Australia about femocrats, which was this conduit between policy workers with government and community sector organisations and NGOs working in the area of ending violence against women and their children. And there were strategies developed between workers on the ground and policy workers to really try and think through how you can make progressive change in this very difficult space. It was particularly evident in the early 90s around how issues around child sexual abuse got onto the policy agenda. But I did wonder at that time whether there was a third arm that could be developed through academia, where in fact activist academics could support with evidence the role of policy workers and practitioners in NGOs and government to try and make and support progressive change to end violence against women and their children. Because we did want to make our research applied, not sit on a shelf, should I say, not sink like a stone, but rather trying to shine a light in some shadowy areas. But just continuing with this issue around advocacy and activism. Advocacy is the active pursuit of engagement with decision makers for the purposes of influencing decisions, and it's an inherent responsibility or duty of a social work academic. I feel like it's an essay question, discuss, because I think there are many queries and questions in this space. Because many of us, I think in the social work area in particular, where we do have that ethic for social justice, would like to be activist academics. But there are many dams and blockages in the way that, in fact, often I think it's more of an aspiration than a reality. When one's applying for grants, when one's working on projects, when one's teaching, the publications, the university service demands. These are things that make it really difficult to be out there, creating the relationships and developing an activist agenda. But there are some strategies that I've tried to use over the years to make research count. So I've tried to work with the heuristic of the knowledge diamond. And this is where there's sort of a humility about recognizing that research evidence is only one form of knowledge making, and that in fact you need to have many facets of this diamond of knowledge. Lived experience is central. Policymakers will tell you what's feasible, what's not, and how they can take things forward or not. Practitioner wisdom is absolutely so central, particularly in areas like social work, but other areas in our allied health professions. So I think that that work with the knowledge diamond has always been so exciting, particularly when we really developed it in the early, about 2008. Margaret Curtis and many others were working on the Who Am I project, an ARC linkage grant that did win an engagement award. It's actually morphed into Find and Connect web resource for forgotten Australians and former child migrants. At the most recent count, it had 10 million page views, and around 1 million of those just last year. So actually ARC grants I find to be really, really helpful. I've had 9 of these, out of my 18 Category 1 grants, 9 of them have been ARC linkage grants. And there's been about 50 linkage partners along the way. And I do think that is one of the major strategies for making research count, is engaging with stakeholders and partners in the early stages as when you're working out the research design, to think about what is it that your partners in either government or NGOs want, and how can we work together to build the evidence in a particular area. I would say one of the big continuities across all my research has been around action research and co-design. You build knowledge as you simultaneously change practice. And I guess we're continuing to use that model of action research, particularly thinking about the methodology with Power to Our Kids evaluations with McKillop, Stop It Now with Jesuit Social Services, and all the Safe and Together projects are really part of building that evidence through action research processes. I think too that evaluations have been really important in terms of trying to make a difference when you've got a core idea and program that you think is really helpful in the agenda for ending violence against women and their children. I think having the opportunity for policy to participate in policy and practice reference groups is also part of trying to make sure that you haven't got your research sitting in the ivory tower, but in fact is out there trying to inform the work and the development of policy and practice. I have to say too that relationships count, and that having a great team is essential. Kristen Deemer and Margaret Curtis, we've worked together since 2007, 2008. Kelsey Hegarty and I have worked together for many, many years, establishing together the MAVE network at University of Melbourne. We've done many research programs and joint supervisions with PhD students. But there have been and continue to be many others. Gemma McKibben, Jasmine Asobi, Larissa Fogden, Lucy Healy, and in the past, and Ravi Tiara and Audrey Mullender from University of Warwick. You know, these have been key relationships which have been part of a collective effort, which I think are the nuts and bolts of making research count. But I also think that knowledge translation partnerships can be really important. This is two streams in many ways coming together. The research that you're building through your projects, but also thinking through the way in which they can be translated and implemented in practice. The Alfred Felton Chair was created with great strategic thinking from Colleen Clare, Dorothy Scott, Bruce Bonahady, Elizabeth Ozanne, and many others. It was an outwardly facing chair. It was based at University of Melbourne, but in partnership with a philanthropic organisation and the Centre for Excellence in Child and Family Welfare as a peak body. I think there are many lessons in the establishment of this chair, particularly for universities. I actually knew no one coming into Melbourne other than my lovely brother Chris and his family. But through Colleen Clare and the Centre for Excellence, key research and strategic relationships were forged within the first month of my arrival into Melbourne, after being 12 years in the UK. And so, you know, it's a terrific lesson about how not to be stuck in an ivory tower, but how to have an outwardly facing chair. I also think that ANROS, a relative newcomer in the Australian grant giving bodies, along with ARC and the UNH and MRC, it's been established and tries to maintain, you know, sometimes under great difficulty, different ways of operating, including holding significant attention to knowledge translation and working to influence key decision makers through research. Their work on ensuring that research partnership grants such as Invisible Practices and the Patricia Project paid attention to implementation and practice change and led us on a multi-state journey of workshops discussing our findings with policymakers, ministers and practitioners throughout Australia. And it does lead me to a key focus on the research since 2016 on projects with David Mandel and the Safe and Together Institute. I've come to see this as a rich partnership in which our practice-led research and capacity building of organisations through communities of practice has worked to provide evidence and much needed alternative all of family model for responding to children living with domestic and family violence. I think this raises an issue for whether activist academics need a knowledge brokering partner to take up the implementation of policy and practice changes and to be the activists that we support in this space. But there's also been some waterfall moments, or should I say watershed moments, where in fact there's been a change of direction and a shift in focus. The projects with the Safe and Together Institute, the Patricia Project, which worked on the relationship between domestic violence and child protection organisations, Invisible Practices, focused on fathers who use violence, the Stacey Project, Safe and Together, Addressing Complexity, and Stacey with Children, the Multi-Agency Triage Project, the Esty Project, Evidence to Support Safe and Together, Implementation and Evaluation, and now a further project on Aboriginal perspectives, have been part of looking and engaging more with the issues around fathers who use violence. Began in many ways also with the Caring Dads evaluation, which was led by Kristen Deemer and working with David Gallant and many others. Also the Fathering Challenges ARC project. You know, we had about 15 partners in that project, maybe 19, can't quite remember. And that was part of setting a shift in focus to look at the fact that actually in this area, if we're going to make changes in the area to end violence against women and their children, that men needed to be engaged. I remember sitting around the table at the Centre for Excellence in Child and Family Welfare with a number of our community sector partners, and I realised that the ground had shifted. And I think that it was really important to get on board. And I think that this is an area also where Aboriginal organisations and their communities have been really clear that making fathers visible and part of the work has been so important. That in fact, every family member needs to have a service. We don't need to actually see all family members together. We're not talking family therapy here. We are talking about every family member having a service, and sometimes when it's safe enough to do so, then different family members will come together. So focusing on fathers doesn't mean to say that we're not continuing to do the work on working to support the partnerships between mothers and their children. But it does say we need to be thinking about and open to the ability to change our thinking in this space. I think another area which has been really important has been amplifying the voices of those with lived experiences, lived experience. And I think this is an area of both continuity and change. That particularly PhD students have been absolutely central to this advocacy journey. I've had 36 PhD students, give or take, depends how much you count the secondary supervisions. But at least 8 have been working on those with lived experience of child abuse and domestic and family violence. They particularly, it's particularly evident in hearing from children and young people and those whose experiences have been marginalised. This is an acknowledgement that it's not only a human rights issue for people with lived experiences to have their voices heard, but it's also such an important content area of difference that in fact, when you look at the PhD projects of Gemma McGibbon, Shawana Andrews, Katie Lamb, Anita Morris, Joni Smith, those projects bring forward different perspectives and areas for action in this area. And it does really highlight how important it is to have that knowledge diamond and to bring together different sources of knowledge, because in fact, the advocacy agenda, the response agenda is very different. So I guess there are many lessons in this area of thinking about the amplification of the voices of those with lived experiences, because it is that there are social justice issues here. It is for advocates in many ways getting out of the way, helping to create the space and understand what it means to be an ally rather than being the voice yourself in this area. I think it's an interesting space, and it's one where we've seen at the beginning of the violence against women movement, there was very much an emphasis on the importance of lived experience. I think as it became mainstreamed, people actually stood back and don't talk about their lived experience as professionals. That somehow it became something to hide rather than something to bring out as an important aspect of what could be contributed in this space. I think now we're seeing a re-emergence again. And so you'll see the picture on the side is of two rivers. They're actually the same river, and one tributary is sort of disappearing down a hole while the other one is continuing to cascade forward. And I think that is part of the story of working in the area of lived experience and making sure we think about how those voices are positioned well within the movement to end violence against women and their children and child abuse. Let me just say that the journey's not over. You can see there are many beginnings. I have to say, it is a question of what are you going to do when you grow up, that there are many beginnings and not really an end. It's a story of complexity with many, many tributaries that at times converge to make a stronger system and at other times diverge and become invisible. So many people have been part of this journey. It's been a story of collaboration, a story of resistance rather than a story of one mainstream. I think there are many issues that have contributed to having a very rich and enjoyable personal career. So some of those ones would be continuity of employment. I have to say, you realise now that this is like gold. At this university, there's less than 30% of the researchers and academics at this university that have continuing positions, depending on how you count this. That this is huge, that the universities have become part of a gig economy rather than having positions like gold, like myself, in continuing employment. And so it's something that's really appreciated. And it's also makes you realise when you look at that continuity, the continuities of research over a long period of time, you don't get those continuities so easily without being in a continuing position. So there's something about that's foundational about that, and that I think is part of the lessons for universities to be rethinking how they're working in this space. I've had very strong female mentors along the way that have been very important to me and which have helped to support my career and have helped to support someone who didn't start with any confidence in this space to feel more confident in this area. I think the Alfred Felton Chair, as an outwardly facing chair, was so valuable and such an opportunity. I've had, as I've said before, amazing colleagues, friends and researchers to work with. And I feel very fortunate to be in the social work department where we've had very steady and strong leadership over many years. And again, there's nothing worse than working in a toxic environment. And life's too short to do that. And I feel very fortunate to have been in a department where relationships have been very well supported and we've been able to accept levels of diversity and to try and support people in all their different roles across the department. I've also have enormous appreciation for the very talented and passionate PhD students that I continue to work with and have worked with. They are such an important part of any research program. And some of our best research in our particular areas of work and in our particular unit in the social work department here and with Kelsey Hegarty have come from our PhD students who just go the extra mile, and we learn as much from them as they do from us. And so that's been a very delightful part of the journey. I also think and want to pay tribute to having a stable and loving personal life. And certainly that's foundational and has been something that has given me the confidence to go forward in particular areas where I may not have felt confident. But just my final slide is really about the academic as activist. I would have to say for myself that I'm reluctant to claim the title of academic activist. There are many opportunities, though, in universities, but I think they are underdeveloped overall in higher education. Though I did notice just this morning, in The Age, where they were announcing the Victorian Women's Honour Roll, that in the change agent section of the honour roll were a number of academics. So I thought, it is an area of opportunity, and it is one that could be, I think, developed much further. Because there are potentially muddy waters here which raise questions about academia and activism, and whether they're two separate flows or whether there can be a convergence between these roles. Like Dr. Barbara Rose has written about this concept of the academic activists. It is a term, as I said, that, and she's also reluctant to claim this term. I think the reluctance is twofold. Firstly, it lies in the could do better category. I'm more aware of limitations and learnings rather than successes in this area. It is potentially an off-salary aspiration and activity. Secondly, activism and advocacy for social justice are not necessarily celebrated within universities. It can suggest a lack of scientific objectivity and a muddying of the waters. Leave it to others to make what they will of the evidence, write it up in journals that no one but other academics can access, and get on with your core business, the busyness of which leaves little time often for outward-facing activities. However, I believe that activism and advocacy take many forms. It lies in the focus of your teaching to engage with issues of equity and justice, the design of your research to shine a light in murky waters, and to collaborate with passion and commitment with others to ensure that the actions we take benefit the most marginalised and the most vulnerable in our society. For each academic activist, there is a densely woven tapestry of experiences and beliefs that create their stories that have meaning for both acts of activism and intellectual connections of activism with academic life. I'd like to finish by thanking you for this opportunity of describing some highlights from my experiences across my career and the collaboration of others in that journey. So thank you very much.
And thank you, Cathy. It's my job to give a vote of thanks. And I noticed that you used the word weaving quite a bit. And that's exactly what I wrote. I said, you've given us a great little tapestry, really, of how your own values, your professional experience as a social worker have really influenced your scholarship. But this scholarship was not an abstraction. It rather was focused very much on the world of social work practice, of service delivery, and of course, social change that underpins all of that. So on behalf of our esteemed guest and audience, a great thank you to you for sharing your journey with us tonight. I'd also just like to thank those behind the scenes as well. They are the unsung heroes. And in this case, it's Mel Schmidt, who just keeps us completely on track. Jane Zhu and Dr. David Gallant. We also want to thank our audience for being here. We had a huge number of registrations for this event. And I'm sure, I mean, we've had a huge number of attendees, 122 are on screen at the moment, which is extraordinary. And I'm sure there are going to be many more who will watch your lecture, Cathy, with great interest. So I also would just like to remind people that a link will be made available, so please share it broadly for the lecture. We also will have another upcoming alumni event late this year, early next, perhaps, looking at the Reflections Project, which is our oral history project. And I would also like to reiterate, given that this is the Len Tierney Lecture, that there is the Len Tierney Social Work Travelling Award, and we really would encourage you to contribute to that corpus to enable many more students to travel overseas. So with that, Lou, you might like to say a few words to sign off at the end of this Len Tierney Lecture 2022.
Thank you very much, Janet, for the vote of thanks, but thank you all the more, Cathy, for raising so many issues in such a terrific oration there. We're glad that the journey is not over as a department, and I'm sure many of the colleagues joining tonight, so that your work is continuing with us. But I think you've just given us such a good provocation around that idea, particularly of academic as activist, how we can translate that into our practice going forward, and how we can engage really effectively with our agency partners and make a difference to the lives of children and families that this research works to address. So thank you also from me on behalf of everyone here tonight. And thank you, Janet, for your contribution as always too. So I think with that, we will close the proceedings for this evening and see you at our next event. Have a good evening and stay dry.